Hello there. I'm Christopher Watkin, and welcome to our study of biblical critical theory. In this first session, I want to take you behind the scenes. I want to take you back to the 1990s, and I was an undergraduate in a large arts faculty of a secular university. And at that time, it felt as if I was existing in two different worlds. The first world was the world of my studies. And you must imagine that we were being thrown every week a stack of books to write essays on. Philosophers like Marx, Freud and Nietzsche, or Julia Kristeva, Simone de Beauvoir. And we had to churn out understandings and interpretations of these philosophers every week. And it struck me as I went through these essays that although these thinkers were very different from each other, they were all doing very similar things. They were all making certain things in the world viable, certain things visible, and certain things valuable. So, for example, most people today probably wouldn't think that something like a working class revolution is something that's possible in the world. But you read enough Marx and see how he thinks about the world, and it becomes clearer that although you might not believe that it's necessarily possible, that for him this is something that's really viable, something that will certainly happen, according to Marx. It becomes viable for you in your world. And these theories were also making certain things visible. So think, for example, about all the feminist philosophies of the 20th century. And the way in which, for some people perhaps, before reading those philosophies, we might not necessarily have noticed the fact that there seems to be one set of rules in society for men and another set of rules for women. And yet we read Simone de Beauvoir or Julia Kristeva, and those inequalities in society become visible for us in a way that they may not have been before. And these critical theories were also making certain things in the world valuable. Most of the philosophers that I was studying as an undergraduate were teaching the people who read them to value the transgression of norms. Anything to do with tradition was bad, and anything to do with upsetting or destabilizing tradition was necessarily a good thing. So these theories were making things visible, viable, and valuable in the world. But I was also, at that time, existing in a second world. It was the world of my church and my Christian union, where we were reading the Bible carefully and slowly and being taught to apply it to the whole of life and take it seriously. And it struck me that among all the different things that the Bible is doing, being the Word of God and living and active and the sword of the Spirit and so forth, also the Bible was doing these same three things that the philosophers that I was studying were also doing. It was making certain things in the world viable, certain things visible, and certain things valuable. So, for example, if you walked into the street of the city where you live today and asked the first 5 people you come across, have you ever considered trusting the promises of the God of the Bible? It's very unlikely that you would get the reply, well, yes, actually, I have considered that, but on balance, I thought that it probably wasn't the right thing to do. People would be more likely to say, what planet have you landed from? Of course not. That's a stupid idea. How could that ever make sense? In other words, it's not viable for them in their world. But as you read the pages of the Bible, as you see how God deals with Abraham and Joseph and Moses and so on and so on and so on, it becomes clear what it would look like to trust the promises of this God. And it becomes clear that this is a God who systematically keeps his promises, and it would be a reasonable thing to do. It's become viable for you. It's become something that's possible for you in your world. And also the Bible makes certain things visible for us, doesn't it? Think, for example, of Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. You may have looked at any number of sunsets in your life, but the thought may never have occurred to you that that is a wonderful testimony of the glory of God. But the Bible makes that visible for you. So next time you look at a sunset, you can say, thank you, God, for this beautiful show of your glory. Or take another example. You can't read many pages of the Old Testament before you come up against the idea that the widows and orphans in society are very important indeed to God. He cares about them in a special way. And it may be that you've not particularly noticed the weak or the destitute or the disenfranchised in society before, but the Bible makes that visible for you, brings it into the foreground for you, in a way that it may not have been previously. And the Bible also makes certain things valuable for us, doesn't it? I remember to the time before I was a Christian, I was 15 or so, and if you'd come up to me at that point and you'd said, I really think that serving other people should be one of your life goals. It should be something that you really value. I would have laughed at you. There was no context in my life, no category for making sense of serving other people as being something that's really valuable. And yet you read into the New Testament and you see that the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. And it's only because he served that I have any life, that I have eternal life at the moment. And you read what Paul says in Philippians 2, that we should have the same mind as Christ had when he became nothing and made himself a servant. You think, wow, this is clearly something that's incredibly valuable for the God of the universe. And if I want to be like Jesus, then I need to value service as well. So both the philosophers and the Bible were making certain things in the world visible and viable and valuable. And yet there was no place in my life, no context at that point at which these two things could talk to each other, at which the Bible could have its say, if you like, in all the debates that were going on in my university course about identity and purpose and meaning and human existence. I just felt that was an incredible shame. Because the Bible does have some really surprising and fresh and exciting things to say about those very issues. And so I wanted at that point to find a way of getting a conversation going between these philosophers and the Bible, not to shoehorn the Bible into the categories of the philosophers and not to just simply hit the philosophers over the head with the Bible, but to try and see how the Bible could be brought to bear on these issues. And I struggled, to be honest. It took me a long time to work out what that might look like. I think there were two pennies that dropped for me to show me how that might be brought about. And the first one was the first Bible overview that I did. So I was a junior leader on a Church of England summer camp, and we had a teaching program as well as doing all the washing up and things after the meals. And part of the teaching program was a Bible overview. It's the first one I'd ever done. And we started at Genesis 1, and we went all the way through the main turning points of the Bible to the end of Revelation. And what really was drawn out was that the Bible is one coherent story from the beginning to the end. Now, it's a complex story. It's a multi-layered story. And there are little side chapels, so to speak, of stories like the book of Ruth that come off the main trunk. But nevertheless, you can tell the story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Now, I find it really hard to grasp for words to indicate just what a paradigm-shifting moment that was for me. Try and think of it this way. It's as if, for the whole of your life, your understanding of what music can achieve is limited to the idea of a toddler bashing an upturned pan with a wooden spoon. Okay, you think that's as good as music gets. Now, I have to confess, speak from experience. That is my experience of lockdown, day after day after day. And then suddenly, one day, someone gives you a set of tickets to go and hear a world-class symphony orchestra play Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, which is one of my favorite pieces of music. And as you sit down, and as the symphony begins, you suddenly realize that what you thought music could be is so impoverished and so inadequate. And it's as if a new world opens up for you at that point, a new world of possibilities as to what music can achieve. That's the best I can do to explain what it was like for me to have that first Bible overview. To see that the Bible from beginning to end is not simply a set of really interesting juxtaposed little stories, but one overarching story, and a story that not only sits within the world, among all the other stories in the world, but that actually makes sense of everything else in the world, the story within which all of the stories exist. And in a sense, I've never been able to get over that. That has become the driving force of the way that I try and understand the world within this overarching frame of the biblical story. But I still didn't know how to bring that story to bear on the cultural and philosophical ideas that I was studying. And so the second penny to drop for me was the first time that I ever read through Augustine's City of God. Let me tell you the story. We were on holiday, my parents and I, in the beautiful Yorkshire seaside town of Bridlington for our yearly family holiday. And I don't distinctly remember whether it rained all week, but it probably did. It usually did on our summer holiday in Bridlington, I'm afraid to say. And so we had lots of time to read. And I can't exactly remember why I'd taken Augustine's City of God with me. I think, just between you and me, it was because I felt it was one of those Christian books you ought to have read. I didn't know anything about it. It's a very big book, so I thought I'll take it on holiday. I'll give it a go there. Two things struck me from that first reading of the City of God. The first is that I understood hardly anything. Most of it went over my head, all these names of gods and heroes and things that happened in Rome, and who is this guy called Varro and all that stuff. But the second thing that struck me was that the little bits that I did understand were absolutely electric. Because what Augustine was doing is he was taking the shape of the biblical story, Genesis to Revelation, and he was using it as a lens through which to read the whole of late Roman culture, as a way of understanding and interpreting that culture, and actually of interpreting it better than the Romans could interpret it themselves. So in the first half of the City of God, Augustine reigns over the whole swathe of Roman culture. He looks at its politics and its spirituality and its games and entertainment. And then in the second half, he tells the story of the Bible. And what happens is that you see he's able to explain Rome to itself better than Rome can explain itself. Absolutely astonishing. It's the high watermark of Christian cultural critique outside the Bible in the history of the church. And from that point on, it became clear to me that if I wanted to do anything like what I was hoping to do to bring these two worlds into conversation, that this was the way to do it. To take the whole of the Bible with the shape of the biblical story through creation and fall and redemption and consummation, and to take the whole of a culture, not to chop it up into little bits, and to seek to read that culture through the lens of the Bible. And so what we have in the sessions in front of us is my faltering attempt to do that with late modern culture, to hold, if you like, a flickering candle to the blazing sun of Augustine's City of God, and to follow his pattern in seeking to do what he was doing in our own day. The very idea of a biblical critical theory might sound strange to some people. After all, aren't critical theories usually thought to be quite anti-Christian? Well, I think there are two arguments to be made in relation to that. I think there's an argument to say that critical theories are actually, historically, as it happens, built on a Christian foundation. And there's a stronger argument to be made as well, that logically, critical theories are necessarily, to some extent, borrowing biblical ideas. So historically speaking, let's think about where the idea of critiquing a society comes from, of standing back from the society in which we live and saying there are things in it that are not good or that are not just, and here's a better vision for society. You don't find a huge amount of that happening in ancient civilizations like Babylon or Assyria or Egypt. It would usually be the case that people who stood up against the ruling authorities in those countries wouldn't have long to live. But there's something very peculiar about the Hebrew nation, because it has this institution of prophecy at its core. Now, the prophets aren't sanctioned by the king, but the prophets are recognized within Hebrew society to have a certain authority. And the prophets are really scathing, often, about the nation itself and about its ruling authorities. They critique Israel from within Israel. And although prophets are very often harshly treated, there's still a sense that they are part of the society and they have a certain authority, even though they don't have an institutional role. And that's odd. That's weird. Having something inside the society, one of the main purposes of which is to critique the society by the standards of God, is not usual in the ancient world. And this tradition of critiquing from within carries on in the Bible, doesn't it? Think of Jesus with the Pharisees and the excoriating critique that he unleashes upon them, you brood of vipers. And think of the history of the Christian church and Christian thinking as well. Think particularly of Augustine's City of God, where he takes the whole of late Roman culture and from a position outside that culture, with a set of biblical measures and standards, he subjects that society and culture to systematic critique. Now, the Augustine scholar, Charles Matthews, who knows a lot more about Augustine than I do, has a very interesting point in one of his lectures on Augustine. And he says that the City of God is the first example in the Western tradition of taking the whole of a culture and subjecting it to systematic critique. Now, people, of course, had critiqued parts of culture in Greek and Roman life previous to that, but he's saying what's new with Augustine is that he's taking the whole of late Roman culture and looking at it with a critical eye. And to the extent that that is correct, that is the origin, the historical origin, in our tradition, of what today we call critical theory, which similarly seeks to take the whole of a society and to range over it with a set of measures and ways of interpreting that aren't simply part of that society itself, and to point out what's wrong with it and what's unjust and what needs changing. So simply historically, critical theory has Christian, has biblical roots, as it happens. But I think there's also a stronger argument to be made, that what today we call critical theory must necessarily piggyback on something very close to a biblical view of reality. It sounds quite a controversial claim, doesn't it? Quite a scandalous claim. So let me explain myself. In order to critique the way things are, in order to critique the status quo, I've got to have some measure outside of the status quo to measure it against. Otherwise, I'm just measuring what there is against what there is and finding them to be the same. So what standard do I judge society by to say this thing over here is unjust or that thing over there is not fair and they need changing and these things over here in the middle are fine? Where's my standard come from? Well, it can't simply come from within that society itself. Otherwise, I'm locked in some sort of circular argument, aren't I? I'm trying to bootstrap myself. Well, biblically speaking, that standard comes from God and from the idea that the way that things are now is not the way that they're always going to be, nor the way that they were originally. So God created a good world without sin. That was the original plan. And the way in which the world is now, where sin is still here, is not God's it's not God's final destiny for the world either. Sin will be done away with in the new heavens and the new earth. And that place and that time provides a standard against which we can judge the present, not from within the present, but from a point outside of it. We know what's just and unjust, what's right and wrong within society because we've got something to measure it against that's not simply more of the same, not simply more of the status quo. And it's really fascinating that towards the end of his book, Minima Moralia, the German Frankfurt School critical theorist, Theodor Adorno, says that what we need in order to do cultural critique well is, quote, a standpoint of redemption. Now, he's no Christian. He's not suggesting that we should all convert to Christianity in order to do cultural critique well. And nevertheless, he reaches for that theological language to describe where we need to stand in order to do robust cultural critique. Because if I don't have somewhere outside the status quo from where to critique the status quo, then all I've really got is a feeling or a hunch or an intuition. I know this thing is unjust because I know it's unjust. And the problem is, if you have a very different feeling or a different intuition, then where do we go from there? I think one thing is unjust, you think another thing is unjust. Well, perhaps the only way to go is for me to try and speak longer and louder than you, and ideally to stop you speaking at all. And I wonder, whether some of what we're seeing in the state of public discourse in the West at the moment is a symptom of that fact that there's nothing to appeal to, and so I just try and shout louder for longer and stop other people talking. But if there is a measure outside the status quo, then it isn't simply a case of what I feel or my instinct. There is a measure, a genuine measure, of good and evil and right and wrong that can make sense of society. So when, from a Christian position, we say that this or that is unjust, we mean more than I don't like it or I have negative thoughts or negative feelings about it. And therefore there's a robust theoretical basis for that cultural critique. It really is unjust. Even if everybody in the world thought that it was just fine, it could still be unjust. It's very hard to get that if you don't have something like the standpoint of redemption. And it's very hard to get anything close to the standpoint of redemption if you don't have something like the Christian story, where the God who is outside the created order is the one who says what's good and evil. And there are these ruptures in history where the status quo is not everything that there is, was, and ever will be. And this is therefore the sense in which any meaningful cultural critique, any position that says there is this thing that is unjust for everybody, regardless of who agrees with that or not, it is wrong and it needs changing. Very, very hard to say that outside a biblical Christian frame of reference. Now, of course, not everybody agrees with that, and people would no doubt raise their hackles. But it's a very hard argument to refute. And so this is why I think a biblical critical theory is not only legitimate, it's almost a tautology. Because all critical theories of society are both historically and logically reliant on the Christian tradition in order to make the moves that they make.